Hello, my name is Tom Simpson, and I work with McHenry County Conservation District. And I wanted to talk to you today about our plant phenology program, uh, and in particular, how that plant phenology program may be telling us something important about how we're going to do conservation later into the 21st century in the era of climate change. Well, first, let me share my screen here. The purpose of this study were really to look, at least for me, as I got involved in the study in 2012, really as a sort of consultant, and then became more and more involved as the farther the study went, was really to look at the relationship of year-to-year changes in weather and how that affected plant phenology, in particular, as that would bear on understanding the importance of climate change to the prospects of conservation and ecological restoration. The study's been conducted almost entirely in McHenry County, but in the 1980s, there were nearby sites in Lake County, Cook County, and Kane County that were also included in the study. We've tried to keep a pretty even distribution of sites and observations in woodlands, wetlands, and prairies over the years. I suspect I've added more woodland sites in recent years, so I suspect, yeah, we're pretty close to rough equivalents in those three basic types. And I want to start off by saying this was really a volunteer project. We've got almost 30 volunteers working in the plant phenology program right now. In a typical summer, we lose a few for reasons that are, unavoidable, but we also add a few. And overall, we've been able to increase those numbers over the last 3 years. And without the volunteers, there would be no phenology program. I mean, if it had to rely on me alone to collect observations, there would be no plant phenology program. So what we're doing in the program is collecting start bloom dates, is collecting information on our native species, and in particular on 81 species that happen to have observations in all 12 of the original of the years in the program from 1980 to up to 2014. That's 12 years of observation. Obviously, there's more than 12 years between 82 and 2014, but 12 years in which phenology observations were collected. There are almost 2,000 species of plants that had been observed, but only 81 of those had consistent start bloom observations for each of those years. We took them across a wide range of ecosystems, and the observations were McHenry County and nearby areas. Each participant was asked to visit their site at least once every 2 weeks. And originally I thought this was pretty minimal in observations. I was really concerned that the delays would really interfere with our ability to see relationships. But doing the analysis in 2014 and 15, I was really gratified to see that volunteers working on this time schedule can collect some really high quality data. I was very impressed by the data and impressed with the relationships I was able to find within the data. So what we're actually observing out there is fairly simple. On those 81 species, we want to get the opening of leaf buds on woody plants, leaf buds meaning the vegetative shoots that are coming out of those buds as they open in the spring. We're looking for the start bloom date on flowering plants, some of those including shrubs and trees, but particularly focusing on herbaceous plants there. We need 1% of the population in that case, but when over 50% of the population is blooming, is finished with blooming, we record a bloom over date. So those are the only three things we're observing. So we're really focusing on those 81 species. We've added about 20 more, and then we've got a set of woody species we're looking at, but we're not trying to do everything. We're trying to focus in on a concise set of species and then collect these three variables where appropriate. Our weather data really comes from O'Hare Airport, and there are a number of sources. I typically use the NOAA Weather Center to get this data, and I'm not assuming that O'Hare has exactly the same climate as McHenry County, only that when weather changes at O'Hare, it's pretty closely correlated to weather changes in McHenry County. And the quality of the relationships we've been able to see between plant phenology and weather would say that's a pretty good assumption. And specifically the weather variables we're looking at are average temperature over certain time intervals prior to the blooming periods for these groups of species we'll be talking about here in just a minute, and then also total rainfall during those periods of time. So in order to do a study like this, you have to divide the species into groups and then test to see whether, split them into groups and then find temperature variables that work with each group. And that's how I put these together. It was a long process in the winter of 14 and 15 as I was working on this initially, trying to get that relationship using various divisions of the plant species in the blooming groups, and then various time periods and average temperatures. And then once I put that together, this becomes a hypothesis going forward that we test each year as we gather data, and then we test to see how our weather variables account for changes in bloom date. You can see these are roughly seasonally divided. Of interest here, this late spring summer that goes all the way from May 15 all the way up through the end of summer. That might surprise you, but all of those plants are responding to spring temperatures. You would think something blooming in September would be responding to June and July temperatures, but as far as I can tell, they're not. They're really responding to spring temperatures. So early on in their growth, something is happening. Some signal is sent from the environment that sets the bloom date on those plants. And the positive responders are an interesting group that are the opposite of that. And they're actually sensitive to temperatures late in the season, but in the opposite direction. So while these others are blooming earlier when it gets warmer, our positive responders are actually blooming later when it gets warmer, particularly when it's hot in July. And this is the sort of relationship we get when we actually look at the data. So each one of these dots on the graph is a year. And so for this is the year 2020. So for 2020, the average temperature in March was a little over 42 degrees. And the average bloom date for the 12 early spring species was about April 28th. So that dot represents 2020. Average bloom date for the 12 species, average temperature for March. Each one of those dots represents another year. I know a lot of you aren't into algebraic equations, but let's look at this just briefly. So this line here is a line that's in a sense approximating the relationship between temperature and bloom date. There's a mathematical process called a regression equation that arrives at that line in this equation. We won't worry about how we get it, but just look at this number here. X is temperature. X, remember from your days of geometry, X variable goes this way, Y variable goes this way vertically. So temperature when multiplied by a negative 1.6 is equal to bloom date, meaning that for every degree increase in temperature, the plants are blooming 1.6 days earlier. So that's an approximation of the relationship between changes in weather and changes in bloom date. 1.6 days earlier for every degree increase in temperature. And higher temperatures produce an earlier bloom date. And of course, we've all known that, particularly with spring species, when we get really warm springs, things start blooming earlier, and cold, wet springs, they bloom later. We've all sort of known that. This is just putting some numbers on that. The coefficient, that's the coefficient of temperature, and the coefficient of determination, the fancy multisyllabic term, it's really referring to this number. And what that's telling us, that 0.379, is that 74% of the variation in bloom date is accounted for by temperature. Now, if this was a perfect equation, all of those black lines black dots would fall right on top of the blue dotted line, and the coefficient of determination would be 1. It's never that perfectly, particularly in ecology. And so 74% of the variation is a pretty good equation in ecology. I want to note just one more thing in looking at this line, and that's 2020. That's why I labeled it. You may not remember 2020, but it was a very wet year. And so when I looked at this and it was standing way off the line, farther than other years, I started to wonder why. And it looks, if you see, look at the bloom dates, it looks like it's blooming about 10 days too late. And so what I did was I started looking at other weather influences that might affect bloom date, and I put in total rainfall during certain periods of time up to and including the bloom dates of this group of plants. And I found that when I included that, it actually, in essence, pulled this point downward. It didn't really pull the point downward, but it brought it into agreement with a linear approximation, so that what it showed me, and we saw this in two different seasonal groups, is that both average temperatures and rainfall were important to predicting bloom dates, but they work in opposite directions. The rainfall, increased rainfall, delays the bloom date. Warmer temperatures move the bloom date forward into earlier periods of time. Let's look at the woody plants. A similar system here. Not as many dots because we have very few years of woody plant observations. They really weren't doing that in the 1980s, but it's something I wanted to include in the study. So each year we'll be able to add a dot to this and get a better and better approximation over time. Here you can see that they're even more sensitive, at least so far, than the flowers. They're blooming 2.4 days earlier for every degree increase in temperature, but showing a similar, pretty darn good relationship, in this case, all the way up to 92% of the variation in bud opening accounted for by temperature. So pretty good relationship. And we can see a direct response of plants to the average temperature. One of the things that occurred to me early on, and then I began looking in the literature for support for this, was that I knew that climate isn't one thing, it's many things when you look at landscapes. And so there isn't one climate in Glacial Park where I work. There are in fact many microclimates that are keying into topography, slope, aspect. And so I started looking online. I could find some support for that fact. Elevational topography can attenuate the effects of warming climates. We suggest when coupled with thermoregulatory behavior, that is the plant's response to changes in temperature, variation in topography may mask acute effects of climate change. So at least some support in the literature that this may be an important factor as we move forward into times as the climate warms. And so I put out a study at some temperature sensors, recording temperature sensors, and put them in many places around the park. And I can see here 6.6 degrees of variation in average temperatures in March. That peak temperatures, that might not be so surprising, but averages over a whole month were differing by 6.6 degrees just based on their location within the park. That's huge, and roughly equivalent to some of the predictions for the increase in average temperatures between now and the end of the century. So quite likely important as we move forward. So let's summarize a little of what we found in the project up to now. Warm years, most plants bloom earlier than in cool years. The shift in bloom date corresponds closely with average temperatures in the spring, regardless if the species are flowering in May or September. The exceptions to this trend are a handful of species in July that bloom actually later because of high July temperatures. 10 midstring and 54 summer species actually bloom later in wet years. So we've shown that rainfall can be important, may be important in mitigating some of the effects of warming climates. At this time, we find no support for the generalization that blooming periods of plants is shorter in warmer temperatures. Now, I'm not saying that isn't a true statement. I know I've repeated it to students many times over the last 30 years, but looking at the data, I can't find any support for that. Even in 2012, a freakishly warm spring, the length of period that plants were in bloom was equal to that in other more normal years. Yes, they started flowering sometimes up to a month earlier, but they stayed in flower for roughly the same amount of time, perhaps for some of them even longer. Differences in average temperature associated with changes in topographic position are in the order of 4 to 7 degrees. Again, that's not a cure for global warming, but it may mitigate some of the more harmful effects of global warming as we move farther and farther in the 21st century. So the question is, and the burning question, no pun intended, is will our plants become obsolete by 2100? And what I mean by obsolete is simply that they'll become artifacts of history, things we look back upon, but not things that are actively a part of how we think about conservation 80 years from now. Will that be true? It's an open question. Certainly there are some people who are pretty negativistic about that. Here's Harris. Restoring historic ecosystems is unlikely to be easy or even possible in the changed biophysical conditions of the future. Hobbes is saying that many historical restoration targets will be unsustainable in the coming decades. Pretty strong statements. Just to start to think about what climate warming means, I wanted to just think a little bit about just variation in climate locally. So when we move north to Stevens Point, we're going up about 5 degrees. When we go south to Springfield, we're going down 5 degrees. We're going north, we're going up 5 degrees. When we go to Springfield, about 12 degrees by the time we get to Cairo, Illinois. And I think this was Noah that was saying that a 3.5 degree increase in global temperatures will produce almost a 7-degree increase in some summer temperatures here in the mid-latitudes. So this is all important. This is important to understand what we're in for in the coming century, or what we may be in for. None of us know that. Here's another estimate. In graphical form, you can see the gradual slow increase in temperatures in Illinois through the 20th century into the 21st. Factors that may mitigate some of those acute effects of climate change, like plants can adjust their bloom date based on temperatures. We've seen that, you've known that. How much can they do that? How much can they absorb and simply respond directly to changes in year-to-year weather and not need any extra help? Increases in rainfall may partially mitigate effects increasing temperatures. That's at least possible. We don't know. I've seen even less reliable predictions about the total rainfall and how that will change. Certainly, we will have more really heavy rain events as we go farther into the century, and we'll have really more and hotter droughts as we go farther into the century. How those two will balance each other out is another question. The shift in basin normal temperatures over decades may select for warm adapted genes already present. I mean, our plants are not genetically identical to one another. Most populations of sexually reproducing organisms are variable, and so we would expect that some plants within the species spring beauty are actually responding differently and opening earlier or systematically later in response to the temperature signals. So if climate starts to warm, it will select out those that are better adapted for that warmer climate, and that sort of evolution can happen pretty quickly. Evolution that requires mutations, it happens much, much more slowly, but if the variation is already there to feed on evolution, can happen much more quickly to adjust the population to those warmer temperatures. And certainly microclimates may be important to mitigating some of those effects of climate change as we move forward. I mean, what's our goal in conservation? I think this is always worth coming back to, because we shouldn't forget that really from the beginning of ecological restoration, and I would contend long before that, we thought of our goal as protecting remnant ecosystems and the plants and animals that live there, therefore the local provenances of plant and animals that were adapted to our climate and soils of this region. And we were pretty strict about that in the early days of restoration. But that may change as we move into the future. We may need to move certain of these warm climate alleles or gene variants systematically northward from populations of the very same species that grow in central and southern Illinois to essentially speed up the evolution of local plants to keep up with that climate change. I think it's too early to do that right now. I don't think it's too early for experimentation. I think it's a general management strategy. It's too early to do that right now, but that's certainly something we need to prepare for. And we may eventually need to protect species from extinction by assisted migration of resistant provenances to suitable climate areas. So we're getting into sort of even more more critical periods during a warming climate when we're starting to worry about actual species extinction. I'm less able to get my head around the idea of assisted migration of whole biomes and moving the prairie oak savanna biome to northern Wisconsin. That seems a bit far-fetched to me, but in any event, I wanted to put it on the list as a sort of most extreme reaction or eventuality in the case of extreme climate change. So what can we do? This is important, but what can we do right now? And that's what I wanted. This is what I think is most important right now. Is we need to learn more about how our plants are responding to warmer climates. And we can do that just by turning our attention to it. The Phenology program is just one small example of that. We need to monitor sensitive species and ecosystems for signs of climate-induced stress. We shouldn't be responding to the news. We should be responding to actual data that we collect, and we can say that, look, these ecosystems are shrinking, key species within them, populations are systematically going downward as the climate warms, and we're responding to that information and not to the popular press about what are we doing about climate change. Well, what we should be doing now is learning. We should establish cooperative relationships with agencies to the north and south so we can begin experimental movement of species and provenances directly to test the effects of warmer climates. We can do that now. We can do it next year. We can start doing it in 5 years. We just need to establish those relationships. If we want to know this, we can know it. We just need to work at it, to learn about it. And the time to do this really is now. And obviously, we will need to work with entomologists and other scientists to learn more about all the plants and animals that are really a part of the ecosystem that are supporting our plants. Will they become obsolete by 2100? I don't know, and I don't think we know, but I think we could. We can't know everything. Of course, we can't know everything, but we can know a lot more than we do now, and that's what we need to focus on in the coming decades. We need to focus about learning about what's happening and what the likely results of that change is going to be, and then to start responding to that information as we accumulate it. Thank you, and I guess I'll take your questions later on. Thank you.